Hello, Mr. Timothy Hutchinson. My name is Gloria Mantooth, and I am working with the Unsung Heroes Living History Project, honoring our local African American veterans and their families who served in the military and made Lompoc and Santa Maria area their home to raise their families and support the community. We would like to thank you for your service by interviewing you and learning your story. By documenting and preserving your story for future generations to come to know that you were here and you contributed. This project is being sponsored by the Santa Maria Lompoc branch of the NAACP, C4 Lompoc Collective Cultures Creating Change, the Fund for Santa Barbara, the Shumash Indians, 3rd District County Supervisor Joan Hartman, and many other local organizations. So before we begin, I just want to ask you if you'd be willing to sign the waiver granting Unsung Heroes Living History Project, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the right to use this interview as detailed in the release at the conclusion of the interview. If so, we will proceed.
Yes, I would. It's my honor. And
Uh,
please call me Tim.
I'll call you Tim. So today I'd like to talk with you about your parents' military service. There are no right or wrong answers. Just remember, or whatever you remember, feel, or were told growing up. If there's something you don't remember, that's okay. Just take your time. So
Okay.
let's start with what life was like for them before the military. What do you remember them telling you about who they were and what their life was like before they joined the service?
So I'll start with my father, Vincent Theodore Hutchinson, Ted, or as I used to call him on base, Hutch. My father is from Harlem, New York. His grandfather was from Barbados. His grandfather used to be a very well-known, well-to-do tailor in Barbados, but when he came to New York, to Harlem, because of discrimination and racism, he was not able to be a tailor, and so he hauled ice up tenement stairs, big blocks of ice. We're talking, 1920s and all of that. So my father had two brothers and a sister, and in his early years, he was a Sea Scout. And being a Sea Scout kind of introduced him to the idea of being in a military situation. My mother was born in Philadelphia, but pretty much right away they moved to Brooklyn, New York, and her parents, her father was the postman, and her mother was an educator, and she went to school in New Jersey, and then she also joined the military after a time. When my mother passed, she was 95. So again, it's somewhere like in the late 30s that early 40s that she was in the military as well. They talk about New York. I consider myself to be an honorary New Yorker. I've been there many times. Family is still there in New York, much of the family on both sides. And my father talked about growing up in New York and growing up in Harlem. It was tough. You had Spanish Harlem, you had blacks, um, some Latino, some Italians, and at first it was tough. But he credits his time in New York with really helping him to become a man and giving him the backbone and stuff that he has now. My father was the kind of person who his grandfather read the dictionary. So my father read the dictionary, and he used to tell us when we were younger that he put some money in the dictionary, and that if we would read the dictionary, we'd find that money. But being as ingenious as my brother Brian O'Shea Hutchinson and I were, we just took the dictionary and tried to just flip the pages out so the money would come out, but it never came out. Um, And I got to tell you, I did try to read the dictionary for a little bit, but I was like, no, this is a little too much. But in his early years, so that was him in his early years, and he went into the military. He was stationed. Of course, he went to Texas for training. He was stationed in Guam and all of that. But in his early years, he and his brothers were pretty good in school. Pretty competitive in that way, as well as his sister. They educated themselves.
So do you remember or do you know how the family reacted when he decided to join the military?
His father at the time was skeptical because of, as I understand it, just his understanding of how blacks were treated in the military and also when they would come back from service, especially the stories about the brothers that served during World War I and how they were treated in Europe as opposed to when they would come back. But for my father, I think it was an opportunity for him to get out of Harlem. When he went for his initial physical, he has flat feet, and so he said that's what precluded him from becoming an officer. Which, if you think about it, is an interesting idea that okay, you have these flat feet, so you can't be an officer. Because I mean, what does that mean? If my feet are flat, I can't give a command. I don't understand what that means. But so at first there was a bit of a trepidation about that because my grandfather, being from Barbados, was just a little, had some trepidation about him joining.
What about your mother,
As I understand
her
it,
family?
right? As I understand it, they were all for it because her brother had gone into the military and was actually an officer in the almost in the Army Air Force. And I forgot what rank he got up to be. I want to say he was like a major or something like that. So they had a different attitude about it. Um, they were very positive about him going in, about her going in.
So from what you were told, well, you already kind of answered that question, why you think that they went into the military. Did your parents ever share stories about boot camp or training?
Um, the only story my father really shared, boot camp was boot camp, but he did talk about the time that he had to ride the bus. I guess it was he was going to go on vacation. I forgot what they call it. Not TDY, IFWAC. I forgot what they call it. But so he was going to go from Texas back up to New York, and he talked about that bus ride where he had to sit, which of course was in the back, and the fact that, and you can imagine, I think it's Lackland to New York, how long that would take, and the fact that after a while he had to go to the bathroom, and every stop they would come to, of course, during that time there was no bathroom for blacks. And so he held it, held it, held it, held it, and eventually said, Tim, either I was going to get lynched or I was going to go to the bathroom. And my father, he's not a little man. He wasn't like 6'5" or something, but he's a good 6'1" and thick. And so he told that story, and my brother and I were just thinking about that. The fact that, you couldn't even, with your uniform on, get off that bus and be able to go to the bathroom until you got across the Mason-Dixon line, you know. So that's a story that always stays with me. Oh, and then, well, I guess we'll get to that, but
Your mom?
yeah. So I'm sorry.
Your mom and her training, basic training?
No, no, no negatives per se. There, she basically was with an all black regiment. I have pictures of that, of her in her uniform with the other sisters that were in at that time. And I think that's something about my mother that's always stayed with her. That ability, she can be very military in her thinking, in her perspective. Almost she can, and that's why she was staunchly. And it was an issue for us as we grew up, because that's why she was staunchly Republican. throughout her whole life. Big Ronald Reagan, love the Kennedys. I mean, we all, get that. The Kennedys, that whole Camelot and all of that. Love the Kennedys, but was a big Nixon fan, big Ronald Reagan fan, Republican, you know.
Can you give us her name? Because I don't think we got her name on
Oh, I thought
record
oh,
yet.
that's right. Yeah, her name is Almedia Verna Hutchinson. Maiden name Almedia Verna Jones. And so her side of the family, uh, her brother Bobby, they are all law enforcement. Um, Uncle Bobby was one of the first beat cops in Brooklyn, New York, black beat cops in Brooklyn, New York, and also, excuse me, and also um, the Williamsburg area of New York, which at that time was predominantly Jewish. Um, so my mom and those guys grew up in Bed-Stuy, right near Boys and Girls High School. I think it's Boys High School then. Now it's Boys and Girls High School. But so my mother had a different attitude towards that. She's a Republican. She was all about America first, and so her journey. She ended up after boot camp. I think, in fact, I know she went to the Pentagon to work. But so her experience was very positive, very strict, very regimented, and so she thrived in that environment.
So, what kind of work did your father do in the military, as far as you know?
Right. So surprisingly enough, my father worked in what at the time was called data automations. And that's when they had those big ICM. What was ICM? They had the big computers, these big rooms, and the big reels. And so he was, and I've always thought that was interesting. Uh, Very forward thinking on his part to be in that kind of environment. So Dad was always in with data automation. So he was always near headquarters, and really thrived. He so we were all over the place. We were before we had us. He had been in Guam. He then got transferred over to Germany. That's where he and my mother met. But yes, he was in data automations,
And your
computers.
mother, you said, worked at the Pentagon. Do you know what kind of job she did there?
Well, I'm sure it was primarily, kind of secretarial type of stuff, in headquarters. She had worked for a couple of generals, no, not like Chappie James or any of those guys, but she worked for some officers and some generals. Again, one of the few people of color at that time in the mid to late 40s being in the Pentagon, but working in the headquarters and mostly clerical and clerical supervision type of position.
And the places that they traveled to or were stationed at, do you remember them talking about those places?
Yes, and I wanted to not get too far. I'm trying to focus on just answering the question without elaborating too much because I can start talking. So, and that is I guess the beauty. It's funny because I think it's really important that when our parents or people that we love pass on, that we need to say their names. We need to continue to say their names and tell their story. I can remember my mother saying to me, "Are you going to forget me?" And I said, "No, of course not." But in doing this with you, I realize how long it's been since I've talked about them. And it's an honor to evoke their memory. So this is the part that of my parents' journey that is so incredibly amazing. So my father had been in Guam, and then he got transferred to Germany. My mother had been in DC, and then she got transferred to Germany. Excuse me. They met in Germany. They got married in a place called Bern, Switzerland. And um, um, my brother and I were, well, I was born in Germany, and then we went to France for a little while. And then Charles de Gaulle, so how long this was, how long ago this was, asked all the Americans to leave. So we left Châteauroux, France, and then we went back to Germany, and then we went to England for a minute, and then we a short period of time, and then we went to Massachusetts, and then of course to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So we went from Lisbon Air Force Base to the base in France to I think it was South Ruislip for a very short period of time, Lake and Heath. And then we went to Massachusetts when my brother was born at Westover. Westover was a SAC base. So in other words, they had B-52 bombers and all that kind of stuff. And I got a chance to ride in one. I got a funny story about that. And then we went to Kirkland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then we came out here to Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, California. So during the time, and that's why I guess gets me kind of emotional, because during the time that we were in Germany, and to be quite frank with you, it was a fairy tale, meaning we lived off base. Um, in the winter, the youth, like you have a youth center on base. So the youth center, you go on ski trips where it'd just be the kids and counselors. And it was incredible. We ride the train from Wiesbaden down to Berchtesgaden to Garmisch, and our parents took us there a number of times and to visit there. And then in the summer we go to Camp Mohawk in England. Ride the train. I don't know if you've ever been, riding the train and just kids. And that's the thing about my parents. Um, I remember families that they never left the base. And it's a 4-year tour, and we kind of got re-upped a couple times. So I think I spent the first 10 years or so of my life in Europe. Um, but so we were there, and my parents, they took us all over the place. I can still remember the time that the first time I saw a Porsche was we were in Garmisch, and we were headed to Innsbruck, Austria. Um, and it was kind of, early morning. And all of a sudden, this Porsche comes up beside us and then takes off. And I can still remember like it was yesterday, watching this Porsche just go down because it's all these switchbacks that take you down into Innsbruck. And that's the first time I saw a Porsche. So the point I'm trying to make behind all of that is, or with all of that is, by doing that traveling at such an early age, it gave us this world perspective. The difference in going to a little village in Germany was that the people of the village, sure, they had never seen any black people before, excuse me, but it wasn't a look of disdain. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a look of curiosity and let's talk. And my father, two things about my dad. One, he was a racquetball player, a champion Air Force racquetball player, handball player. My brother used to talk about getting those spankings. Didn't get too many of them because with hands like that, you do one or two, I get it, pops, I got it. We don't need more spankings. We got it. Um, So he was champion racquetball, handball, excuse me, handball first, then racquetball. And then he was also a singer. So he sang in the opera in Wiesbaden. And Wiesbaden, Germany, is a spa town. It's where the wealthy Germans people go to go to the spa and massages and facials. And this is back in the day. I'm talking about in the early '60s. Pops would get a massage and get not really a facial, but a massage. And that's why I learned that it's okay to get a massage. You know, um, Mom go get facials and stuff like that. So it was like we were living in Camelot. It was a dream. We had like a base car that would come get us if we needed to go somewhere. My father was the manager of the NCO club. So every Sunday we'd be at the NCO club for after church. And our church was this big Episcopal church in Wiesbaden where I used to be, an acolyte and all that. So it was like a fairy tale, excuse me, because we were away from what was happening in the United States, civil rights and all that stuff. But to get back to answering your question, yes. So we were in uh, Germany, France, small time in England, and then Westover in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then out to Lompoc. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And I'm loving hearing all of those. Some of those stories are familiar to me as well,
Mm.
for our time spending and knowing your mother and father when we were in Germany and
Yes,
being in
yes,
the gospel choir and traveling.
yes.
I know this interview is not about me, it's about
No, but
you,
it's
but
all connected.
just sharing that
Yes.
we are connected in that way.
Yes, yes. I mean, I can remember one quick thing. I can remember when my on Sundays, sometimes we wouldn't go to the base club. Sometimes we go out to the countryside and we go to some German guy's house and his family. I remember, oh my God, I still can remember their names. Really close friends of my mother because that in those '60s, that was the cocktail time where people would smoke and have martinis and all. It was that Frank Sinatra time, Sammy Davis. And in fact, my father tells a story or told a story about the time that Sammy Davis Jr. came to Wiesbaden, performed, and some white Air Force guys took him and painted him white. Um, Never gets talked about, but it happened, and I'm talking about in the early '60s. Um, and I don't know if I don't think you ever came back, but so on some Sundays, we wouldn't necessarily go to the club. We go out in the countryside and it's like a big farmhouse, and there'd be this big table of all this food and Wiener Schnitzel and Brötchen and wine and just all this food, dumplings and just the whole as we all know from growing up there, and we would play, and my father would get up with the rest of the guys there, and they would sing. My father also did some singing at the opera, the Kurhaus in Germany. Excuse me. And for a long time, the point about it kind of being like this um, fairy tale was that when you first come to a base, as you know, your housing is not always ready. And so you have to stay. In the case of Germany, we stayed in this hotel, which is called the Hotel Bloom, and on Blumenstrasse. And it was right in the center of the city. And I remember these ladies would come up in the morning because my mother would, can you bring some porridge? And and my mom would dress us in these little sweaters and stuff, and it was quite the, like I said, the fairy tale. And my mother used to always say, you're gonna grow up to be the president, just like the Kennedys, and say those little things, but telling a young black kid that in Germany at an early age, without the juxtaposition of what was happening, the civil rights movement creates this mentality. It created this kind of worldview that later on I had to kind of adjust it a little bit. But so yes, we We were in all those places. I got to go off on the tangent there.
No problem. So, for the most part, while your parents were in the military, they were not separated. Were they ever separated at times?
Um, yeah, Dad would go on some TDY, but temporary changes, but not for a long period of time. The only time that they were really separated for a long time was when I was a junior in Lompoc and junior in high school at Cabrillo High School in the village, and I was really active in school. And we had just bought a house in the village. I can't remember. I was we were so excited when we bought a house in the village. You know, it was like we don't want to leave. It was a trip when we first came to Vandenberg. I remember we were coming from Albuquerque, and I remember my dad came home one day and he said, "We're at Kirkland, which is a fighter base at the time. It's a joint base now." And I love New Mexico. I love everything about New Mexico in terms of the land and just traveling. And there was this particular cuisine. It's called sopapillas. It's like a big puff, and you put. Okay, this is my wife calling me. Hold on, let me see if I can let her know what I'm up to. Okay, I gotta hold on.
Go ahead and
Okay,
share.
yes, ma'am. So I just wanted to share two quick things. One, now, unless you've been in California for a good while, you may not remember this guy. He was a weatherman for, I think, ABC. His name was Dr. George Fishbeck. And it just so happened he was my sixth grade teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when we were at Kirkland. And I remember seeing him on the TV. And I was like, that's Dr. Fishbeck. He's crazy. I don't know if you remember him, but he was really animated and he was so funny. So that's the first thing. The second piece is when my father said we were going to California, you know, we were ecstatic. And so we came to LA, we went to Disneyland, traveled, did all this, you know, all that stuff. And then my father said, okay, we're going up to the base. And we're thinking, okay, let's go. Get to the base. Let's get to the base. Let's get to the base. And, you know, we were just driving, 40 minutes, an hour, hour and a half. And we're like, okay, maybe this is all a big joke. You know, we got past Santa Barbara, did that little turn, and all of a sudden it was just all this fog. And so for the very first time we came to Vandenberg, it was just real foggy. And we were like, where are we? And our guest housing at the time was right when you make that little turn and then at the missile, but to the right is these little like a transit quarters. And so that was our first uh, vision or time at being at Vandenberg. I always never forget that first time. I was like, where are we? And little did I know what was, going to unfold next. All kinds of stuff. Um, um, yeah. I did want to share, if I could, one anecdote that really stands out to me in a lot of different ways to my mother and father, but primarily what was happening in our country during the 70s and how my father was a part of that. Can I share that? Okay, so one day, as I told you, my father was from Harlem, mother's from Brooklyn. My grandfather was a tailor who had to haul ice. My mother's family, for that time, her brothers and sisters brothers had jobs that were considered middle class, from being delivering the mail, which her father did, to being porters on trains. Okay, so that dichotomy started there and it continued, okay, throughout. My mom was more like Fifth Avenue, let's shop, and so she wasn't about, the revolution in that sense. My father was, trying to do his job, and he used to talk about how he was disrespected at times by NCOs, white NCOs on the base, and how he would just deal with it. My father was no BS. He's a straight up kind of guy. He would just boom, had a deep voice, and he would come right at you with stuff. So there's that. And also being a chief, there was a period of time when he was in charge of all the NCOs on the base. So, something happened with the colonel or the general regarding NCO, my dad was part of it. Okay, so there's that. The piece that stands out to me and it had effect on the rest of my life is one day my father came home. This is when we were on Sirius Avenue in the Village. And he said at dinner, he said that the general and the colonel called him in and said, Sergeant Hutchinson, you're going to teach Black history. And so my father went out and he got all the books. Fire This Time, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Malcolm X, Spook Who Sat by the Door. I say We Wear the Mask by Fanon. Roots, got all those books. I said Invisible Man, got all of them. And I read them all. My mom, not so much. I read them all. And then my father said, so Dad, what are you going to do when you go in the first time? There's going to be officers, there's going to be enlisted. He said, well, Tim, this is what I'm going to do. When I first walk in the room, I'm going to just wait till everybody gets settled down. And then as loud as I can, I'm going to say, nigga. And my mother was like, my mother like, what? But it was brilliant because it immediately got right to it. Because of the idea that, as we learned, all of us learned, that on a military base, you don't talk about politics and you're supposed to get along. But what you find out is that being ordered to get along, you find out that, well, really, we get along. We all had different things that we do. I think, weren't you on drill team or something, flags or something, right? So you're dealing with white, brown, football and sports, same idea. My best friends, I consider my brother, Ed Smith, white, blonde-haired cat. You find you do have these commonalities, but yeah. I thought what my father was tasked to do showed that the military was trying to figure out some way to deal with all this Black power stuff and address it. Yeah. It was informative and instructive in that way. It was also very funny. In fact, my father tells a story about when they were at K-Town. I'm sure you know K-Town. Yes, ma'am. Kaiserslautern, Ramstein Air Force Base, and I think it's called Joint Base something. I'll never forget, first time I went to Ramstein, you go over this little hill, and then all of a sudden you see this whole spread in front of you of like 3 or 4 football fields at that time, 1975, of M1 tanks. And then you see all these jets in the air, and you feel like, I am very protective. As a matter of fact, there was a time when I could not even conceive of living off the base. I used to always say, what are people out there doing? Because we had everything, right? You got the commissary, you got the theater, you got the school, you got whatever you need, youth center, and plus you got all this weaponry around you, So my dad bought those books home. He taught that class, and he did it not internationally, but nationally at other Air Force bases, and it was very significant because it took down a lot of walls. Now, it didn't solve discrimination in the military, but for that period of time, with those particular generals and colonels who had the mind to want to do that, it definitely brought some people together. And I like to share that story because it was a launching off point for me. Up until that point, pretty much through high school, I was always thinking Air Force Academy. I'm going to be a pilot. Everything I did in high school was relative to that, from being president and key club, boys state, all those things, grades, whatever, was geared to that. But after that, there was something that happened for me personally where the kids that went off to the academies the year before us came back and said, man, you don't want any part of that. It's all this sort of indoctrination. And I was like, what? But I ended up going to UCLA, obviously, and taking foreign policy classes and discovering what I would consider like to be the truth of what was going on with America. And my father and I used to always argue, and I'd always start by saying, I love my country. I love my country. I love my country. But I want it to be all that it can be. And that's when we were able to have a good conversation. My father didn't vote for Obama the first time. He wasn't feeling it. And we had a long conversation about that. But the second time, we both cried together up in Seattle for his inauguration. So I know it's a lot of ideas I'm throwing in there, but I'm just trying to give a an idea of the exposure that my parents gave to my brother and I, so that we had what I would call a worldview. And so that when a good buddy of mine, same buddy Ed, one day we're talking, and he said, his father was a chief master sergeant too, and knew my father. He's white, so they were both working together. And one day Ed says, "Well, you know, Tim, we don't come from nothing." And I said, "No, sorry, bro, can't go with you on that one because my parents exposed us to so much that we're like little rich kids, you know." And so I never, to this day, don't think like that we don't come from nothing. Now, yeah, Pops wasn't making any money as a chief master sergeant. We know about the military, but that time, because like I said, there's people that never left the base. So there's that time that of exposure that gave my brother and my brother is an engineer with Raytheon. He's in Poland right now. He on his in his adult life, he's been stationed in Saudi Arabia. He's been stationed in Japan, and in all those places. And I know you know this because of our upbringing as military kids, we're able to adapt to different environments quickly, and that's because of our parents. You know, taking us around, showing us. I speak a little German, a little French. You know, uh, that experience, it's indispensable.
Well, Tim, are there any items that your family has that still remind you of their service that you hold dear, and why?
Well, the main thing, and I won't go on and on. I just say that one of the hobbies that my father had was his camera, and so we still have that camera, and we have pictures. Some of them are faded, but we still have pictures of that time. And to me, that's the most important heirloom that we could have is those memories. Um, you know, I my mother's jewelry is actually at Mrs. Hutchinson, my second mom, not related, lived with them for a year at Mrs. Hutchinson's house. It's actually in their safe. Some of her jewelry. Clem, my wife, has some of her jewelry. So and my sister-in-law Chet has some of her jewelry. But the main thing that we have is in terms of heirlooms. My father wrote a book called From Harlem to Rio, something like that, in Alaska, because towards a lot of part of his life, he was working for Pitney Bowes, and he would travel from Spokane, where this was his last assignment before he retired and moved to the Seattle area, to Alaska. So he wrote a book called From Harlem to Rio, or whatever, talking about his life. So I have that. And the other heirlooms that I would say I would have is, besides the pictures and that, is his voice, the sound of his voice. And I think that's also very important for us to be able to, from time to time, I used to have messages from him, you know, to be able to hear our parents' voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because with time, you know, memories can recede, especially as we get older. And so I think going back to my first part where I got a little emotional is just hadn't talked about them in a long time like this. And to be able to do that is an honor.
Wonderful, wonderful. When future generations of your family hear about their service, what do you hope they understand and remember the most?
Mm, that's a really good question. So I don't think you can criticize something until you've served that entity or that thing. I hope that my nephews, Jonathan and Cassandra, my brother's children. Cassandra is a I'm going to say junior, doing great, straight A's. Jonathan has graduated from Mount St. Mary's. And my son, who is a third year at USC, just to straighten my hat on that. It's all good. Let me just, I felt like my hat was a little crooked. Let me just straighten that. It's okay. Okay. So my son, who's third year at USC, it's all good. I'm really very excited about the academic programs at USC, which it should be on the money we pay. But but is that they see that these are people that came to America, came to the United States, grew up, and were a part of the system, part of contributing to uh, our country, gave of themselves to our country, and uh, yeah, just gave their lives, put their lives on the line for our country. And so there's that respect of putting on the uniform. So it's like you can't really, and because of them, I'm able to criticize. I'm a dependent. I wasn't even in the military. I'm taking that and saying, okay, because of that, I can say this. So it's just a respect that they came to this country and excelled in a time where people of color weren't, you had to be exemplary, and came and excelled. So that's the takeaway of their story of perseverance, dedication, preparation, education. My father went on to get his master's degree in business through the Air Force. So to take those ideas of having purpose, of having purpose.
Well, Tim Hutchinson, we want to thank you for sharing your memories today. Your perspective helps keep your parents' story alive, not just as a veteran, but as a whole person and a family member. Thank you so much.
Well, and I just want to say thank you guys, because we're getting to a point, if I may say, in our country where there's a concerted effort to get rid of the documentation, the archives, the history of our people, of Black people, African Americans, Negroes. It's funny. I used to always joke. January 1st, we would always check with each other and say, "Well, what are we this year? What did Jesse say we are this year?" I said, "Well, now you got to check with Al Sharpton. Let's see, what are we this year? Are we Black, Negro, colored, what?" But back to the point of what you guys are doing is so indispensable. And it's, again, my honor and pleasure to be a part of it, because there's a concerted effort to erase that history, to erase the history of the Tuskegee Airmen like Mr. Art Hicks, who was our teacher at Cabrillo and who introduced us to the idea of Black studies. I don't even think they have that at Cabrillo anymore. And because of him, we were able to just have a period of time in class. I'll never forget it. We had our little afros and doing our thing, our time in class to discuss those things that were happening around us. He was at the forefront of that. And he was a Tuskegee Airman.
Yes.
Put his life on the line for our country. Mr. Hicks was my mentor. And in a lot of ways, to be honest with you, I feel like in a way I kind of let him down. I was supposed to go to law school and do some things. And, I went on my journey. And at a certain point, I'm like, I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to be the guy that hires the lawyer. But I am now, my wife Clem and I are really talking to our son and prayerful that he does become a lawyer, because that opens up the door to so much. And he can do so much with that. So we hope he stays on that path. He'll make his choices. But I get it now. Mr. Hicks's daughter went to Harvard, big time lawyer and judge. We still keep in touch. But again, what you guys are doing is indispensable. These archives that you're creating is indispensable, not only to us as a race, but to the history of this country, of the contributions that men and women of color have made to the military, have put their lives on the line. I'm sure some of the people you've talked to were in Vietnam, in combat situations. My father, he didn't have to go. He was in Germany at the time. But I used to always say we're still serving the effort in Vietnam by what we do. But anyway, so again, kudos to you guys and Godspeed in what you're doing. Appreciate being a part.
Thank you, Mr. Hutchinson.